Already, okay. So the recording is in progress apparently. I must have changed the settings, or Zoom did it on me without me having anything to say about it. So people are filing in, and I'd just like to say welcome. Really glad to see quite a few of you joining us today. Takes the robot a minute to let everybody in. So while we're waiting, I'll call on our speaker to kind of do a bit of a chat, and then when I think everybody is here, I think everybody seems to be here. So I'll carry on and say what I was planning to say. So very much welcome to everyone. Before we begin the formal part of the webinar, I would like to mention that we are recording, and I will let you know, actually the recording started by itself. I think I receive automatic updates on Zoom, and I think that that's a setting that they have changed because I did not choose that. But anyway, so the recording has started. I want to make sure you know how to participate. Your face will not be shown. If you move your mouse or touch your screen, depending on your computer, your Zoom toolbar will appear with little icons. You'll see a raise hand feature, just looks like a hand. And if our speaker asks a question that requires a yes/no response, just click on that to indicate yes. And then we will see how many people said yes, and then I will take that down again. You don't have to click to take your hand away. And then the other feature that's more important on the toolbar is Q&A. And during the presentation, we're going to ask you to hold your questions. However, if you have a question as we go along, it's better if you type it in when you think of it rather than waiting. So type your question into the Q&A and then scroll to the bottom of the Q&A box and click on submit. And then we can see that there's questions waiting for us. And I'll monitor those in case occasionally there might be something that really needs to be answered right away. But okay, and then I'd actually like to ask each of you to take a moment right now to type in something into the Q&A box, if you don't mind. You could put in a question if you have one already, or you could indicate where in the world you're joining us from, because I always find that interesting. So you could do that. Now, if you want to move the thumbnail view of whoever is speaking, you can just grab the top of it with your mouse and just shift it over to one side, so in case it's in the way. So I've now finished the administration part. So I'd like to say good afternoon, everyone. I'm responsible for the Inquiring Minds monthly series, which is brought to you under the auspices of Toronto Mensa. And I warmly welcome you to this Zoom edition of Toronto Mensa Inquiring Minds. My name is Kathleen Smith. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And by way of introduction, I want to start by mentioning Walter Mitty is a fictional character who was created by James Thurber in a 1939 short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. The character is a daydreamer who imagines himself as a daring and heroic person. The term Walter Mitty has become a common way to describe someone who daydreams about a more exciting life. How many of us have or had jobs here on the ground while dreaming of something grander? For Lola Reid Allin, that dream turned into reality. As a very young child, inspired by watching jets flying in formation, Lola decided that she would be a pilot when she grew up. Her story is remarkable for at least three reasons. One, at that time, in the 1960s, it was almost unheard of for a woman to have such a career. In fact, even now, only about 5% of licensed commercial pilots are women. Two, Lola grew up in an emotionally cold environment and was the victim of domestic abuse in her first marriage. For many people, these factors would impede their progress in forming and pursuing life goals, but Lola was not daunted by these experiences. Three, Lola experienced egregious verbal abuse from colleagues, male pilots, many of whom were the pilots in charge when she was flying along with them. Nevertheless, Lola was able to maintain focus on the instrument panel and the weather conditions, even during turbulence, despite the negative stress. All of which I find remarkable, all of these points. For today's presentation, Lola Reid Allin has chosen the title Highway to the Sky, Pathways to Success. Welcome, Lola.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It's a pleasure to be here. And I apologize for my slightly scratchy voice, but we're going to get through the presentation, no problem. The presentation itself, the PowerPoint, is about 20 minutes, and afterwards there'll be time for Q&A, and then Kathleen and I, of course, will have a discussion about the book, which, of course, talks about my life, which is why I call the presentation Highway to the Sky, because it's like my book, Highway to the Sky, An Aviator's Journey. And although the book talks about aviation, it's really meant to be an empowering book for anyone who wants something different than what they're told they should have. So, for example, if you wanted to be an astrophysicist but you're discouraged, you want to be a rocket scientist but you're discouraged, there is hope, and it doesn't relate necessarily or exclusively, rather, to aviation, but to any of the STEM careers, or perhaps any career in which, if you want to have it, if you want to be part of that career, you might be a unicorn. So it could be a Black person in a white environment, a white woman in an all Black, all male environment. It's You need a lot of determination for sure, but not once, even though there were some days when I didn't want to go to work and I came home crying, I still love flying, and I still love flying very much. So let's proceed with my PowerPoint presentation, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. Would that work, Kathleen?
Sure. Yep, go ahead.
Absolutely. So I'll do a share screen. Okay.
Great.
There we are. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I really appreciate your support and your interest. So I've entitled it Highway to the Sky, Pathways to Success, because what I consider success may be very different from what you consider success. Our benchmarks are all very, very different. And another way to look at is perhaps our goals are the same, but there are many different ways to get to those goals. So as Kathleen mentioned, I am an airline transport commercial pilot. Just get an airline transport commercial pilot. I'm also a chief flying instructor, a photographer, scuba dive master who worked commercially in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, an author, obviously, and an adventurer. And I've traveled to more than 65 countries. And while I have no problem with cruises, most of those 65 countries have been in-depth explorations of those countries, rather than a 2 hour venture on land from the boat. So when I was a little girl in 1959, the Royal Canadian Air Force formed the Golden Hawks, and they were flying F-86 Sabres. So they were Canada's first aviation or aerobatic flying team, and it was to celebrate the RCF's 35th anniversary and the golden or 50th anniversary of Canadian flight. So I grew up in Belleville, Ontario, and these planes were based in Trenton, which is about 18 kilometers west of Belleville. So our home on Belleville's west end was on the flight path, whether taking off or landing, depending on the prevailing winds. And it was really exciting to see these planes. And I thought, wow, what a great career it would be, how challenging, how rewarding. And what even was more exciting, when I was 7 years old in 1962, my mom and dad took my sister and me out west for a family reunion. I think my mom just wanted to get there as quickly as possible rather than driving with a 7-year-old and a baby in a car for about 3 or 4 days. And it was really rough. It was late August, early September, lots of thunderstorms, and we were in a turboprop, which still today goes either through the thunderstorms or around the thunderstorms. But keep in mind, in 1962, radar wasn't the science it is today. So it was very, very rough. And actually, while I was writing my book, and I talk about this in the book, my developmental editor said, "Well, Lola, what can you do to make us really feel that it was 1962 and not 2022?" And I said, "Well, my mother chain smoked the whole way, all 4 flights. She chain smoked. She was terrified." And I say all 4 flights because we could not fly nonstop from Toronto to Regina. We had to fly Toronto to Winnipeg and then take an even smaller 40-passenger turboprop from Winnipeg to to Regina. During that flight, I said something to my father along the lines of, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot. And he very dismissively said, "Don't be silly, girls don't fly airplanes." And in part, he was right, although he did work as a maintenance engineer in World War II. So he probably saw some of the women Air Force service pilots from America or Canada's Air Transport Auxiliary pilots, but he chose to ignore those women who were actually considered civilian volunteers. And by 1962, very few women were flying commercially. In fact, probably no females were flying commercially until 1973, when Canada hired its first commercial female pilot. And in America, two were hired that same year. There was, of course, a problem because dad was right, and this is a thought picture here of my dad. He was right. Women really weren't flying, and in my view, I absorbed what he said, that women weren't flying, and literally because being so close to Frenton, everyone that would come to Belleville shopping, it was a much bigger center there than it is now for Trenton. So Trenton Air Force crew would come into Belleville, and they were all men. Certainly they had wives, but the men were the pilots. And even a few years later, when Tom Wolfe wrote The Right Stuff about the Mercury astronaut program, 1958 to 1963, it was assumed not only that men had the right stuff, but white male. So going forward a few years, um, we have, of course, Top Gun, and in the original version in 1986, all the pilots were male. And of course, there was a shout out for the original breaker of the sound barrier, Brigadier General Chuck Yeager, in the movie played by Sam Shepard. However, in the more recent version of Top Gun Maverick, there was a shout out now to women as military pilots. In America, women have been flying for the military since 1973, although not in combat. So, what was I to look forward to? Pretty much the same as all women. We were looking forward, generally speaking, to perhaps getting a university education, but after that, we would become wives and mothers. I kind of laugh here. Put as much care into your appearance as dinner. Raising children and cooking meals isn't enough. Now, I also want to emphasize I do know how to clean house. I do cook and clean and sew. And it's important to have teachers. It's important to have medical professionals, flight attendants, which are in this photo would have been called stewardesses, or legal secretaries like my mother. Now, these photographs are deliberately old because I chose them to represent the time period. There's nothing wrong with these careers except that they're forced choice careers. When all the guys in my class and in high school and public school were looking forward to careers that were vast and diverse, women were more or less looking to being domestic employees or perhaps nurses or secretaries. Now, these are old photos, but this is a much more recent photo, and you can see here we have gorgeous blondes. The male is still the captain here with the four stripes, a nod here to a person of color, and then as a male purser off to the right. But women have been flying almost as long as people have been flying. So the first heavier than air flight was in 1903, of course, with the Wright brothers. Canada's first flight was in 1909. And then the world's first licensed female pilot here is Ramon de la Roche in France, March 8th, 1910. March 8th is, of course, International Women's Day, but we do not celebrate the licensing of Ramon de la Roche on March 8th, but rather the resolution of a labor dispute. Harriet Quimby was America's first licensed female pilot, the first woman to fly across the English Channel. And I put purple around here because she had this amazing purple silk flying suit. Now, you may not even have heard of either of these women, but it's quite unfortunate for Harriet Quimby because the weekend or the time that she chose to fly across the English Channel was the same day that the news of the sinking of the Titanic broke. And of course, that's tossed all other news off the front pages. There are, of course, some notable firsts. Elsie McGill was the first Canadian woman to earn a degree in electrical engineering, the first woman in the world to earn an aeronautical engineering degree. And it says here how a woman conquered terrible handicaps and became chief engineer of Canada's great hurricane fighter plane factory. Here she is, the hurricane fighter plane factory in Thunder Bay, which was then Fort William. And so her two terrible handicaps were, first of all, she was female, and her second handicap was in her third year of her undergrad degree at the University of Toronto, she contracted polio, which certainly was a handicap. In fact, in this photo here, she's using one cane, but in fact, in order to walk, she needed two canes. But what made Elsie McGill so different when the rest of us were looking forward to diapers and dishes? Role models. And that's one reason I like to do these outreach presentations. Role modeling is so important. Now, her role models were her parents. Both her parents were journalists, and both her parents were lawyers, and her mother was the first judge, female judge in British Columbia. Fabulous movie that you can watch here on YouTube, Breaking Through the Clouds, the first women's national air derby. There are about 20 women who set off in America. It was in 1929, and the national air races for men only had been going on for several years, but this one for women was dubbed the Powder Puff Derby. Not everyone completed the race, but those who completed, Louise Thaden won the heavy category. Phoebe only won the light aircraft category. A nice little note of trivia here. Competing aircraft had to have horsepower appropriate for a woman. Opal Kunz's 300 horsepower Beech Travel was considered too fast for a woman to fly, even though she owned it and she flew it to the race. So she had to find a less powerful aircraft to race. It had to be 200 horsepower or less. One of the women who raced there was Marvel Crossan. You notice here in 1900 to 1929. She actually died during the air race. She was an experienced pilot. She was the first female bush pilot in Alaska. She worked there for a year and a half with her brother. When she crashed on day 2 and was found on day 3, air race organizers and newspaper men emphasized not that Marvell Crossan was a bad pilot, but this was positive that their assumptions had been correct, that women were not suitable for flying. 2 or 3 days later, after the plane had been studied, it was found that there was a leak of carbon monoxide from the engine into Marvel's cockpit, and she passed out. There is evidence to suggest that as the plane descended and sort of spun out of control, she got some fresh air and tried to jump, but there was a problem with the plane. However, it was, again, a priori proof that women were not suitable to fly airplanes. Of course, Amelia Earhart, we've all heard of her. First woman to fly solo west to east across the Atlantic Ocean. A great book here by Amelia. And my personal favorite here, Beryl Markham, first person and therefore the first woman to fly solo east to west from England to Canada across the Atlantic Ocean in 1936. She was also the first female bush pilot in East Africa, in Kenya. Some other trailblazers. Jerry Mock was the first woman to fly around the world, 1964. Here she is landing in, or just after her landing in Saudi Arabia. There were men at the airfield, of course, only men at the airfield. They looked inside her aircraft and were astonished to find that she was the sole occupant of the airplane. To their credit, however, they gave her a rousing ovation when they realized that she had flown the plane herself. Now, they called her the flying housewife, which was not incorrect. She was married. She had 3 children, 3 adult, 3 teenage boys. But in fact, she had studied engineering. So again, there was this tendency to kind of minimize her achievements. A few years later, this magazine in 1964, only 4 years after Jerry Mock's flight, sort of rebated that idea. A little housewife here. If I can fly, certainly you can fly. Now, I found this magazine when I started flying in 1979, and I found that not too many things had changed. In fact, when my first husband, Paul, and I went to the airport with our 3-year-old son, I was the only female at the airport. Even the admin staff were male. So, what does Amelia Earhart say? The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. Your fears are paper tigers. In other words, once you look fear in the eye, it just melts. It's difficult to be what you can't see. And again, that's why I like to do these presentations. If you don't know that you can be a female or pilot, if you don't know you can be an engineer, you don't know anyone who is an engineer, it's hard to imagine yourself in that role. So with that in mind, at no time during my first few flight lessons did I think this will be my next career. I had a good job in the bank. I was working in the computer department. Of course, I didn't think this would be my career because men were pilots, but taking lessons was the first step. So interestingly, after about 3 months, my husband and I, even though our marriage was on the rocks, and that's why we were taking flying lessons to try and bring us closer together, we bought this airplane. Within a few months, we separated. It really was irreconcilable. And when we separated, he got the house and I got the airplane. But the authentic, not once did I think I wanted to be a female pilot. I wanted to be a pilot. We don't hear people say, I'm a male engineer, or I'm a male pilot, or I'm a male doctor, or a male firefighter. We just wanted to be a pilot. So, despite that, I could not imagine that in 2 years I'd be flying Twin Otters -6 300s for the Ontario government in the subarctic. So I was the first female flying Twin Otters on scheduled service. A few years later, I was de Havilland Flight Safety's first female employee and first female flight training and grad school instructor supervisor on the Twin Otter. So I apologize for the pictures. We just didn't have the same quality of cameras. That is, I wasn't carrying around the same quality of camera that we have the luxury of having today with our iPhones. The point here is be confident. Despite adequate training, many qualified women feel unqualified to apply for new positions. They think, oh, I don't quite have all those qualifications. Whereas a man will go, oh, I have all of them but one. I'm going to apply anyway. Or if we're miraculously hired, we continue to doubt our competency. Walk tall, be proud of your accomplishments. And in fact, after a few years, not so long, really, people started writing articles about me. My friend here, Joyce Spring, who, in fact, for those of you who have read the book, the first chapter opens with a woman named Joy, and this is Joyce Spring here, an article here in Guelph, and the Women in Aviation History Bush Plane Museum in Sault Ste. Marie. My name appears right here on the wall, which was absolutely shocking to me. I'll be frank. A friend of mine said, "Are you the same Lola Reid whose name is on the wall in the Bush Plane Museum?" And I said, "I didn't know there was a museum in Sault Ste. Marie, so I think it probably is me." And then Canadian Women in the Sky, and then just a few other interviews as well. And of course, since the publication of my book, I've been interviewed several times. So, the motivation here is until you spread your wings, you will have no idea how far you can fly. If you don't try, you've already failed. And probably my favorite, as the great Gretzky says, I miss 100% of those goals I don't take. Strive for excellence. Nobody is perfect. Continue to improve and self-correct. No matter how determined a woman is, there are some problems. There is still a gender gap for major world airlines. Now, interestingly enough, the top four in percentage-wise all start with I: India, Icelandair, and Ireland. Now, I explain this to everyone. The overall average of these is 4.7% of licensed active commercially employed female pilots. And I don't want to misunderstand. I'm sure this crowd will understand the difference here, but 10.9% of pilots are female who work for Icelandair. But that in no way suggests that Icelandair has more actual female pilots than Air Canada or United or Lufthansa. And in fact, America has more female pilots than anyone else in the world, but the percentages are quite low. And why is that? Because our attitude remains the same. When we look at a man in uniform, in a pilot uniform, we assume that that man is the pilot. When we look at a woman in uniform, even though she is wearing a jacket with 3 or 4 stripes, we're assuming something else. We see a woman first, and we forget to look at the outfit. I'm afraid I don't have time to bring you a drink, sir. I have to fly the airplane. Other common questions are, aren't you just keeping the seat warm? Or where's your husband, boyfriend? Where's the pilot? And my personal favorite, which was asked of me on the ramp while standing beside an airplane in full uniform, was, didn't you just borrow that jacket? Now, spoiler alert, all the guys I worked with could go down to I guess Tip Top Tailors and buy a suit off the rack that was approved for our particular airline. I, however, had to have a tailored suit because I have a female figure. So I still wonder what that man was thinking, who he wondered I borrowed my suit from. However, that's still the assumption. We're still looking at women as opposed to this person has profession. And unfortunately, I would love to say that I was the only person who's ever been asked those questions, but there are actually dozens of comments daily on private Facebook groups, private LinkedIn groups, talking where women can vent their frustrations. And I'm talking only about pilots because that's what I know, but I'm sure there are other similar um, sites for other STEM careers. What you have to do is believe in yourself, be committed to success. Don't listen to the doubters. Don't let the limiting beliefs or the opinions of others keep you from being the best you can be. And this doesn't mean only when you're 18 years old. This means when you're 25, when you're 40, when you're 50, or like Kathleen, when she was in her 60s, decided to go back to university and get her PhD. Wow, that's fantastic. So we do need support groups because when I was flying, I was alone. I was really a sheep, or maybe a little lamb in the wilderness surrounded by wolves. And I had some really nice wolves to support me, but there were some who weren't so nice. And even though the 99s were founded in 1929 by Amelia Earhart and 98 other women, I didn't join until recently because up in Northern Ontario and Northern British Columbia, where I was working in both cases as the chief flying instructor and as a charter and medevac pilot, in the 1980s and 90s, we didn't have cell phones. Phone communication was very expensive, and writing a letter would be helpful, I'm sure, but not much could have happened. But today, the 99s is a very vibrant organization, 7,500 members, 58 countries, 154 chapters, 11 in Canada. And I just finished returning from Denver last month, where I participated in an Authors Connect bookstore, 36 aviation authors writing either about themselves or about other women in aviation, and that was sponsored by Women in Aviation International. So seek allies, join professional support groups. You are not alone. The women who have stepped out of line, defied expectations, paved the way for you are there for you. So I just want to end with a bit about my book, a gripping memoir of resilience filled with moments and heartbreak and triumph, but not just about flying, but about breaking free of societal expectations and navigating life on your own terms. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to follow our own dreams, whatever those dreams are, and never give up. But be aware that you may have detours and look at them not as detours or roadblocks, but as challenges that you can overcome with hard work and determination. So thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions, and I look forward to a discussion with you, Kathleen.
Okay, that was wonderful. Thank you, Lola.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, first of all, I did ask people to put in where they're joining us from, and I always find that interesting. So, Rani is here from Switzerland, El-
Wow.
Elka from Oakville, Ontario, Jeff from Olympia, WA, USA, John Roberts from Portland, Oregon, Yanil from New Jersey, USA, Frederick from Oakville, Ontario, Ron Wild in Toronto, John from Winnipeg. Now, Ron has a question for you. Lola, I like how your Aero career decision was inspired by a flight to Regina, airfield of the first licensed commercial pilot in Canada, Roland Groom. That's a comment. He's not asking you. Let me scroll
Thank you
down.
for that, because I did not know that. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, my dad was from out west, and because we were scattered all over the globe, actually, we would meet back in Regina just because it was so much easier for us to do that than travel to Europe and to America.
yeah.
Yeah, it was an epic flight. I loved it. It was like being on a ride at the fair. However, my mother didn't like rides at the fair, so she was not quite as enthused.
Terrified. So,
That's
Lola,
an amazing, that's an amazing conglomeration. I had no idea you'd be getting a crowd from worldwide. That's
yeah,
most impressive. Thank you so much for joining, everyone.
yeah, that's a shout out to Mensa International. It really is. Um, Lola, this is a question from me. What was your father's occupation?
Well, he was a jeweler. He had joined um, the the Royal Canadian Air Force in World War II, at the beginning of World War II, to escape his life on his parents' farm. So what I hmm, my relationship with my father was very difficult for most of my life because he had been forced, he felt he had been forced by his parents, as so many people were during the 1930s in the Dust Bowl of the prairies. He felt he had been unjustly forced to leave school following grade 10 so that he could support his parents' family. And he joined the military to get away from his parents, to get away from working to support a family that he didn't want. Um, and what he did want to do was become a pilot, probably like every other young man who joined the military in World War II. However, to his dismay, and for this I feel for him, he had suffered a hearing loss as a child from, repeated earaches and probably not enough money to see a physician, and so he was not qualified to be a pilot. So he became an aircraft maintenance engineer, which was a skill that he was particularly suited to. He then transferred that to being a wonderful watchmaker. He was highly regarded, and then he branched off and became a gemologist and sort of part-time rock hound as well. But he didn't want children, and so when in 1954, when my mother got pregnant, um, it was the start of the end of their marriage, I'm afraid. So we always had a rocky relationship.
Yeah. I wonder how many stories are like that from couples who married during the World War. I don't know. But, there were a lot of
Yeah.
hurried
Yeah.
marriages too at that time. But
Mhm.
in fact, my mother's first husband was in the Royal Air Force, and he was shot down and killed.
Oh,
And then my mother married again to Jack, who was flying as a navigator in the Canadian Air Force. And he survived and went on to have a family.
oh,
My
wonderful.
mother had a daughter from first marriage, and then I came along, and my brothers came along in the second marriage. But my father survived the war, so
Yes,
that was quite an accomplishment back then.
really. One thing I learned from my father was not to be bitter. Things will happen that aren't to my liking for sure. Things don't always go as planned. Be aware that you may have to make those detours, treat them as challenges. Whereas he was very bitter, even to the end of his life at age 87, he remained very bitter and resentful. And I do talk about that in my book. I really, I wanted my father to like me. He was a very interesting man, but I took him flying and he was very clearly very unhappy being in the airplane and very upset that the daughter he didn't want had become the pilot that he'd wanted.
Oh,
So I feel very badly for him, but I did learn never be bitter like that. Always look at the bright side of things,
okay.
which I think also served me in good stead. Many people have asked me, so, a lot of the things that happened to me, my bullying first husband, some less than friendly colleagues, some who seem quite desperate to sabotage my career or speak ill of me to others to persuade them to not be supportive of me. Um, I looked at it as the zeitgeist of the time. I'd never seen a female pilot before. They'd never seen a female pilot before. They really did not know how to treat me. I mean, apart from being, common decency, being polite, but they really were uncertain. All the women in their circle, their mothers, their wives, or their girlfriends, um, not and girlfriends, or girlfriends, were not professional women. One was a flight attendant, so that was professional, but that was a girlfriend. She was a girlfriend. So it was a very different time period. And of course, I guess I should have said she was a stewardess at that time, that was an accepted role, a very traditional role for women at that time in the 70s and 80s. So it was difficult for all of us. I think they had probably a harder time adjusting than I did because I wanted to be there. And for the most part, some of them did not want me to be there. So there were times that I didn't want to go to work. And there were times that I came home and cried because all I really wanted to do was fly the airplane.
There's one person I remember from your book, one co pilot or pilot flying beside you at least, who was trying to understand at least. And he said he wasn't sure, so he would ask whether he should hold the airplane door open for you so you could get out, or should he let you do it yourself? What would you prefer? So he asked you, he didn't just make an assumption.
That's right. And I had the big crush on him anyway, because he was super smart. He was one of three of us at that particular company that had attended university. In fact, he actually had a master's degree in mm, geomorphology, I believe. So, he was thoughtful and kind, and but even he didn't know what he should do. And the answer, by the way, is just treat me like an equal.
Yeah.
If I'm carrying all the bags, yes, please open the door for me. But but otherwise, no, I'm good. Excuse me.
Yeah. Fred Lee is asking you, what age did you start flying at?
I was 24, the same age as Amelia Earhart, when she began flying. And inspiration and encouragement can come in strange ways. So I mentioned my first husband, Paul. We had been married about 4 years. Our marriage was on the rocks, and we hadn't really discussed it, but I think we knew it. He was an alcoholic. I guess you're always an alcoholic, but at that time he was a practicing alcoholic. And he was also a bully. And he there was an incidence of violence after I left him. But for the most part, he was just, a towering 6'2" athletic bully who made a lot of threats. So think of, like, the bully on the schoolyard. You're kind of scared of him. You don't want to rub him the wrong way. But he wanted our marriage to work. And he loved me. He loved our son. He was a great father. And he suggested, actually, one day he came home and he suggested we take up golf. And I don't want to offend any of you who are avid golfers, but I said, no, thanks. I think I'll pass on that one. But a few weeks later, he came home and said, let's take up flying. And I was astonished. And he was like, why? Why? You've always wanted to fly. I said, yes, but where will we go? Where would we learn to fly? This time we were living in Ridgetown in southwestern Ontario. And he said, well, there's an airport near Chatham at Charing Cross, actually. He said, and at that time he was working for the Canadian government in the health of animals. And he had been driving around. He was at a farmer's field, at a farm, checking out the animals. And this other airplane had, buzzed low, which you're really not supposed to do, but that's what they did. They buzzed low, wagged the wings to say hi to the farmer. And Paul himself had the inspiration from his father. His father was a government employee as well, had an airplane, and so Paul's father and Paul's uncle, so two brothers, had three airplanes, three light aircraft between them. And so Paul had that inspiration. And I feel so strongly about that you can't be, or it's difficult to be what you can't see. And that inspiration might be the man next door or the women next door. For my current husband, he wanted to be a doctor since he was age 6, which is pretty young. But guess what? His father was a gynecologist. His father's going to be 99 this month, but he's no longer practicing. So his father was a gynecologist. His uncle, brother of the gynecologist, was an ophthalmologist, and their grandfather was a general physician. So he knew early on that here's a role model. If dad can do it, or grandpa, I can do that too. So when I say we, I go to many schools, I go to service clubs, extended learning opportunities to do these presentations, and we also participate in, they're called a variety of things, but girls take flight, girls fly too, girls can fly at various airports throughout the world, actually. And these are sponsored by the 99s, by Women in Aviation International, and by COPA, which is Canadian Owners and Pilots Association. And they, each of them, at least one day per year, offer free flights to girls, or girls and boys, to inspire them to careers in aviation. And a couple of years ago, in Picton, in Prince Edward County, the Prince Edward Flying Club, a couple of members and I arranged or organized a girls in aviation event that day too. We had some pilots taking girls flying, and we had um, aircraft aircraft companies come to the event. We had schools, colleges, aircraft maintenance engineers. And because I entitled it Find Your Wings, and I was, of course, referring specifically to aviation, but I wanted to be inclusive in the sense of maybe you want to be a firefighter. So I invited the local female firefighters to come and the local female OPP officers to come so that boys and girls get not only to see that girls can be firefighters or police officers, but that boys can see that too, because women know that we can do those things and that we're able to do these things. We have to work with the larger population to change those attitudes that are still restricting women today. Otherwise, I mean, I don't think that there's ever going to be 50% of female commercial pilots. I just don't think that number of women, that many women want to fly commercially. But 5% is so ridiculously low. I think if we got to maybe 25 or 30%, that is also what's called sort of the tipping point, because there is power in numbers, of course. So if we get to 25 or 30% of female pilots, I think that would be very a great achievement.
Wow. Next question from Jeff. Have you flown a kit plane or perhaps even built one?
No. Sorry.
Okay. And
Pardon me.
JD,
No, I have
JD,
not.
oh,
I have not.
you have not. Okay.
Some of the planes are excellent. When I was actually the chief flying instructor at Waterloo Wellington Flight Center, the man I was dating, who I talk about in the book as well, was building a racing aircraft. Now there are some, and it was not from a kit, but he bought the blueprints and he was building the whole thing from scratch. It was absolutely beautiful. Had I not broken up with him, I would have flown that, but not a kit plane. I mean, I felt so strong. He was such a perfectionist. I would have flown that airplane, and it was a fabulous air racer. On the other hand, there are some planes that, even though they must be examined, I guess, and pass certain tests at various stages of the construction from a kit. I've never actually had the opportunity to fly it. But I am not a big fan of ultralights. I will say that.
Okay. Now, JD, that's Jahangir. I would like to hear your thoughts about automation and artificial intelligence as it relates to human piloting and stick skills.
Well, even when I was flying, um, we were encouraged to use the autopilot, not for takeoff, not for landing. So, autopilots have been around for a long time. I'm absolutely amazed that, with the technology today, that the planes are able to take off and not all planes, obviously, but take off and land with remarkable precision. I do feel that there is perhaps an over-reliance on that, but we have to do training annually, like recurrency training annually, not using the autopilot or all the bells and whistles, shall we say, but actually hand flying it during in a simulator and being exposed while hand flying the aircraft or an autopilot failure, as if you had an autopilot failure, um, and being exposed to a variety of emergencies and multiple emergencies, which you can never do in a real aircraft. So there are certainly some benefits, but I think you can be over compliant on so many um, of the artificial intelligence and the systems that the aircrafts have today to basically fly themselves. But I remember the same boyfriend that I was telling you about, he worked for Ward Air when Ward Air hired the Airbus. And at first everyone was very terrified actually of working on the systems that were called fly-by-wire, and yet after a while they loved working on the system. So it's just a matter of getting used to it and not letting the airplane fly you. That's still very important because the pilot is still there. You have to monitor it and make sure that it's doing the correct thing.
Thank you. Yan Li asks, This is so inspiring, Lola. You
Thank you.
also look so amazing, like in your 50s. Do you think it is too old to start flying for a career after age 50? Is it a safe career?
Um, is it a safe career? Yes, absolutely. It is a safe career. Um, some of the incidences that occurred in my book probably would not happen today. There was one, for example, this is sort of a two-part question here, so I'll circle back to the other. There was one incident, for example, when there was a, a widespread electrical storm that covered Manitoba and Ontario and Saskatchewan. It was massive. Planes were detouring, turning around, they were detouring, they were canceling the flight, they were not, they were avoiding flight at all costs, but not the captain I was flying with. Of course, no. We thought, oh, we're just going for a short flight. It shouldn't be, well, he thought we're just going for a short flight. And I'm thinking, this is really bad. But even I thought, well, I think we're going to make it to the first airport. And we did, but just barely. Because of the electrical storm in the 80s, the plane wasn't protected enough and it stopped the transmission of um, information from the ground-based um, VORs, ADFs, the ground-based signals, navigation aids to our airplane. So we were actually in cloud with only one piece of equipment, a distance measuring equipment, and of course the basic six, like your vertical speed indicator, your airspeed indicator, all those basic six, were still working, but we didn't have any navigational equipment and we didn't have any radio equipment. So that would not happen today. But is it a career, to get your license and start a career at age 50? Maybe. Um, Somebody suggested a few years ago that I should, apply to a particular uh, air carrier because they were hiring. And I thought, geez, I don't think so. Um, I would encourage you to get your license. Um, my first husband got his private license and his commercial license. He was 30. He never planned to use it as a career, but it will certainly increase your knowledge. It gives you a great feeling of empowerment. Think of like, oh boy, when you're 16 years old and you learn to drive the car, that was really fun. Well, when you fly the aircraft solo, it's really empowering. It's also pretty terrifying. It's like, oh my gosh, I hope nothing goes wrong. And if it does, I hope I can be nice and calm and I'll just get this done. So I'm actually pretty calm, incredibly calm in moments of stress, even though I have a bubbly personality. Um, but to start a career at age 50, it's pretty expensive. You'd probably spend $100,000. You can get it done in 2 or 3 years. That's not an issue. You certainly won't recoup your expenses. But if money's no object and flying is fun, you will love it. There's a long, I'm saying 100,000, and I'm also assuming, hold on here, I might backtrack a bit. Normally, people think, oh, I'm going to be a career airline pilot. So that would be private, night endorsement, commercial license, multi-engine, instrument rating, and you need 1,500 hours to get hired by a major air carrier or even a regional air carrier. But you could do private, commercial, and get a float endorsement. Fly 2 or 3 months of the year in Northern Ontario. That you certainly could do that, or private, commercial, and an instructor rating. And we are short of instructors, and you could do that, and it would cost you a whole lot less than $100,000, probably 40, $50,000. Float flying is expensive, but you only need I believe it's 7 hours of float flying to get your float endorsement. But no one will hire you, of course, with only 7 hours of float flying. But you can work and gain time on floats. Does that answer your question?
Well, actually, Emily has another one, which is the million-dollar question, in my view. Lola, what gave you the confidence to fly Despite discouragement from your dad and society, where did your confidence come from?
My grandfather, I think. I was always a pretty determined child. Um, uh, Not afraid to take risks. Um, I'd say my grandfather. So my mom and dad, as soon as they had one child, which was me, their marriage started to disintegrate. And I think it would have been fine if my sister hadn't come along, and that certainly did ruin their marriage. Neither of them really wanted children. Mom didn't get married till she was 25 and was pretty angry that when she did get married, she had to quit her job with the with CN Railways because at that time um, women could work. Obviously, she was working, but married women could not work, and she had to quit immediately. So she was pretty angry about that, and she never really wanted children. They were good parents. My book is not a sob story about how terrible my parents were. They were standing, wonderful parents who did all the right things, but they weren't terribly loving. However, my mother's parents wanted more than one child, which was my mom, and they were absolutely thrilled to look after their grandchildren. And right from the start, I sort of focused on my grandfather who was outside doing things. Excuse me. Outside doing things, active. Whereas when my sister came along, she was perfectly happy to gravitate to my grandmother, who was inside, being very sedentary or baking, cleaning, doing very traditional female things. Whereas grandpa was into science and, kind of cool projects like that. Excuse me. Hmm. I apologize.
Okay, Fred has another question, and JD has another question. So, Peter, Fred, I should say, how many planes have you flown?
Oh, hmm. How many types? 20? It's kind of a guess. Not a lot, I guess. Twin Otters, Dash 8s, that's the biggest one. Several different versions of Cherokees, different Cessnas, a Cessna Caravan, um, Navajos, a lot of Piper products.
A real collection. And I guess they're all somewhat different, just as cars are somewhat different.
They are, they are absolutely. I mean, different horsepower for one thing. Um, um, the Cessna Caravan is a single engine, but the power plant is the same as the Twin Otter. Um, the 300 series. The Dash 8 is different, but I flew the Dash 8 100. So yeah, they're all different, but the Caravan, the Cessna 172, and the Twin Otter all fly fairly similarly.
I recall in the book that you had your license, and then you showed up at another airport, maybe it was Muskoka, I don't remember. And they said, well, we don't have the type of plane you trained on. We have a different type, so we have to
Yes,
give you some lessons on it.
yes. So I'm not sure that I'd recommend my training regimen. So my husband and I started taking flight lessons on March 17th, and 3 weeks or 3 months later, it was time for our 2 week summer holidays at his family's cottage up in the Muskokas. But in order to get to the Muskokas, we had to drive past the Muskoka airport. And we promised ourselves that we would not go into the airport and we would spend the 2 weeks trying to put our marriage back together and time with our son. So, so we get to the coming up towards the airport, and Paul says, "We should go in and take a look." And I said, "Oh, no, no, we shouldn't. We should not take a look. We should go to the cottage. Let's go for a swim." He goes, "Oh, no, no, let's just take a look." So sure enough, we go in, we take a look, and I think that we probably would have both taken lessons then, like we had been doing in Chatham. In Chatham, we had been learning on a Cessna 150, but in Muskoka, they are learning on a were learning on a PA-28, which is a Piper aircraft Cherokee, called a Cherokee, which is a low wing. So you've got a low wing Cherokee and a high wing Cessna. So that was one difference. Changing schools is different because, of course, you're going to have different instructors. And I was also, or we were also going from a very settled area, right? Southwestern Ontario is a densely populated area, and navigation is done by roads and cities. And of course, identifying it, even at 4,000 feet, you could see Lake Huron, you can see Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. Excuse me. But up in Muskoka, you navigate by the shape of lakes and the occasional road and the occasional little village which will be marked on your map. So it was a really big change. So Paul decided that, or Paul not decided, but agreed that if I wanted to fly, he would spend the time at the cottage. It was his parents' cottage, um, at the cottage with his parents, and our son. So that's what we wound up doing. I wound up flying, and he wound up spending all the time at the cottage, whereas I spent most time at the airport, which was great. I mean, I was greatly, I'm indebted to my husband, um, despite his issues. He was a very supportive man.
Okay, JD says, thank you for answering his previous question. Do you think that in an emergency situation, whether it matters if the pilot is male or female, is there any research that shows if males may have more of an ego and thus may not listen as well to the air traffic controller or first officer's warnings to react well in an emergency?
There is a lot of evidence, yes. I think perhaps the question even suggests that as well, that certainly a lot of that has changed, but that was certainly the case following World War II. In World War II, the captain was in charge, and that continued along. In fact, many captains, even during the 80s when I was flying, thought that FO, which stands for first officer, meant something else, as in don't bother me and just FO. Yeah. And I'm quite serious about that. So, and I think there have been many incidences of when the first officer has wanted to speak up or has spoken up, and the captain has been so confident. And this is a dynamic between first officers and captains, regardless of gender, right? Because for many years there were just male pilots flying. So this is an issue. So then, yes, when you add a female first officer and a senior male captain, yes, that adds to the possible issues for sure. There's communication can be an issue. The attitude that I'm in charge is certainly an issue. Then on the other hand, the issues I had in a couple cases were that the pilots were just so complacent. They had done the route so often, and that's also a big problem when they're not quite asleep at the wheel. They're paying attention, but we've all been there. I guess I can't exactly use the word, but let's say you're driving on a major highway, 401 in Toronto. I've driven that route from my hometown to Toronto so often. It's like, wait a minute, where am I? I don't know. Where am I? Have I passed Brockville or Belleville? I don't know. Where am I? So it's that sort of thing. You've done the route so often. Yes, you're paying attention. Yes, you're driving. Yes, you're flying the airplane, but you may not be as aware because you've done that route so often. So complacency is a big issue. Ego is a big issue. About 40 years ago, and in fact, it was just following, remember the big crash in Tenerife when two planes hit on the runway or one was taking off? After that, airlines began focusing, and pilot training began focusing on CRM, which is cockpit resource management. and using everything that's available to you, which would include the first officer, and talking, because until that point, it had really been the captain's show. And in fact, um, one could not entirely blame the captain for that, because if in fact an accident occurred, it was the captain who was blamed. The first officer was not. The captain was blamed. So you can hardly blame the captain for wanting to be in charge completely if he, and I use the word he, was going to take the blame for any problems. But that has changed, and there is a much more dynamic, interactive flow between captain and co-pilot, or pilot flying and pilot not flying, as we now prefer to call it. And the other thing that's changed, maybe not changed so much, but compared to, let's say, 40 years ago, some airlines prior to 40 years ago, you really, as a first officer, you often didn't take control of the airplane. But now, and for the past 40 years, every other leg is flown by the first officer. So the captain will fly one leg, the first officer will fly the next leg under the guidance of the experienced captain. So it's a great way to build hours safely. Experience.
So the captain is the senior pilot in charge on the plane, and then
Yes,
the
yes,
first officer is the co-pilot,
correct,
who may
correct.
have the same training, but is definitely licensed to fly commercial
Oh,
aircraft.
yes, absolutely. They will have the same training, or certainly similar training, and that training will be specified by whatever the licensing body is. So Transport Canada in Canada, Federal Aviation Authority in America. And not only are you, once you get all your licenses, that's not the end of your training, or uh, what's the word? That's not the end of your training. That's the best way to do it. You're still, every year, you must pass an aviation physical, a medical, to see that you're physically qualified to fly. And every year you must do a flight test on every aircraft, not just one aircraft, but a flight test on every aircraft that you are licensed and likely to fly for that particular company. And that's up until the age of 40. And then after the age of 40, those tests have to occur every 6 months. So, and they're not done by the same person, just like my training was done by many different people. So the person who did my flight test for the multi-engine was different than the person who trained me. For my instrument rating, it was different than the person who trained me. It was from Transport Canada as an instructor. Transport Canada came to flight test to see if I was up to standards, and I'd been trained by somebody else. So it's not just one person testing you. And every year you're continuously tested to make sure that your standards are being maintained. And you are able to not do well on two particular um, uh, facets of that particular flight test. And then, but if that happens, you are retested on those items. If you fail more than two items, and I guess the better thing to say is do not meet the standards rather than the word fail, which seems to have very negative connotations, but do not meet the standards required for more than two, it's a complete retest, but you are retested. So you're constantly being scrutinized, tested, and to ensure that your skills are up to snuff.
Okay. Yanli and JD are both saying thank you. Yanli saying thank you for the great inspirations, Lola.
Thank you.
Now, JD has another question, and you may have alluded to this in part. Is there specific training provided now regarding flight deck culture to ensure that there is a professional dialogue and focused on the highest safety for passengers?
There is absolutely. Um, I mean, you can mandate a lot of stuff, but honestly, once you're up there on a one-to-one, things can be a little different. I'm not saying it is, but people are people, and people have good days and bad days. And if you're flying with someone who doesn't want you there, regardless of why, whether it's the captain, a male captain who doesn't want there's some how to put it. We don't like everyone we meet. So sometimes it's difficult, regardless of gender or color or religion, whatever. Sometimes we just don't like that person. But yes, we are encouraged to treat everyone the way we would like to be treated and maintain professionalism. Sometimes it breaks down, for sure it does. But yes, that it is encouraged.
I think that's a very responsible answer.
Well,
Yeah,
it's the truth, right? I mean, you can legislate anything, right? We can legislate that we have to be nice to everybody all the time, and sometimes it just doesn't happen, right? It just doesn't happen.
Elka.
Um,
So let me move on to the next question. So Elka in Oakville is asking, would you please comment on the racial distribution of pilots? Thank you.
I would love to, but it's we don't actually have those statistics. The statistics, Canada, excuse me again. Canada does not keep statistics like that, or at least in historically they have not. If they are currently doing it, it is um, a new recording, a method of data keeping. I did recently return from Denver with the Women in Aviation International. And this year was a focus on the achievements of Black women in aviation, specifically two women who were featured in a book called American Wings, two women who flew, two Black women who were pilots in Detroit, no, in Chicago in 1930s. So they were inducted into the Hall of Fame, and uh, Teresa Claiborne, who is a retiring um, Black airline captain in America. So she was also inducted. So because of that, understandably, there were a lot of Black females attending the conference. Not all of them were pilots, but I can't give you any numbers. I'm sorry, my voice is going, I think.
That's okay. JD wants to let you know, since he asked those questions and you gave him such complete answers, that he's a fellow pilot, gliders only, he
Oh,
specified,
nice, nice.
which is kind of cool. And actually, I have a question of my own,
Yes.
and that is, at one point in the book, you describe, you're early, very early in your training, maybe your second lesson, and you're sitting there and you're learning about the controls, the rudders, and so on. Can you tell us what it's like to sit in the pilot's seat, and what is it you're dealing with? Like, there's rudders. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's actually a lot like an airplane or an airplane. It's actually a lot like a car, only think of a car that has two bucket seats and two steering wheels and two foot controls. So of course you'll have the accelerator and the brake. So it would be like completely dual control. So the captain always sits in the in an airplane always sits in the left seat, but that's also where the student pilot will sit. So the instructor will sit in the right seat. In most cases, the instructor will sit in the right seat. And when the instructor or the student pilot move the steering wheel, which is called a control column, but the steering wheel, and it moves pretty much the same way like this, but it also moves in and out because you're moving the elevator at the back of the airplane. But whoever moves the controls, if only one person moves the controls, that both controls move. So that's one difference. And then the foot pedals in a plane, they're exactly the same on both sides of the airplane, and they're rudder pedals, and they move back and forth like this, and they control steering on the ground, and they also move the rudder because they're called rudder pedals, but they move the vertical rudder at the back of the airplane during flight, but they're used for steering on the ground. It's comfortable. It's a little tight. Um, if it's why many people today prefer training in a 172, which is a four-person or three-passenger aircraft. But I always like training in the 150, um, mostly because it really spins really well. And the 172 is, for most part, most is not. It's designed to be rented and taken on a cross-country flight, not for aerobatics.
Well, you've been very comprehensive and conscientious about answering all these questions.
Oh,
And
I have
you're,
what I have what I forgot to mention though. When I talked about the black pilots,
Mhm.
or black women in aviation, and actually it was quite interesting. The some of the attendees came from Africa, which was amazing. So I had an opportunity to meet airport operations specialists from Nigeria, which was really amazing. And in Kenya. And what else came? South Africa came, but there are a lot of Indian pilots, student pilots, and pilots in Canada and in America, and it's not surprising. You may recall the chart I showed that Air India and then Vistara, which is also India, have the highest percentage of female pilots. Um, and they have been flying, female pilots have been flying commercially in India since 1964. So way ahead of America. The first in America and Canada were hired in 1973.
Wow. Now, Lola, when you and I were talking before the webinar, we were talking about whether we would do any readings from the book. And with your indulgence, I would like to share the final paragraph of your book with
Thank
everybody.
you. That would be lovely.
I just think it's such a beautiful way to summarize. Lola writes, I have fought the shackles of traditional female roles and male dominance. Despite setbacks and a circuitous route, I've maintained my feminist stance throughout marriage, motherhood, and a rebel career. While searching for authenticity, I made many mistakes and hurt many people, but finally I know who I am and who I want to be. Life is a privilege I've chosen to fill with challenges, but without these opportunities to learn and grow and find my true self, my life would be a different kind of death. Very, very lyrical and well written, very well written, as is the rest of your book. And
Thank you
Lola,
so much.
I would like to say thank you for this wonderful presentation. It's been great. I can see all these clapping hands and hearts rising on the screen.
Lovely. That's so
Isn't
sweet. I
that
love that.
lovely?
Of course.
and
Well, thank you. It's been my honor to be here.
and I just want to let you know, Lola, that we're going to be sending you a small speaker gift as a token of recognition for your
Well,
talk
thank you.
today. That
Thank you.
comes from Toronto Mensa.
Well, thank you
So,
very much.
so thank you very much to you. Thank you to the audience. You've been a terrific audience. We've had some great questions, very
Yes.
motivating. And so thank you all for being here today. So I'm going to say goodbye at this point. So
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
bye-bye.